Hi, everyone, and welcome. My name is Pam Vossler. I'm a 1981 graduate of the University of New Hampshire, serving on the UNH Alumni Association Board of Directors. And the UNH Alumni Association serves as the bedrock of the UNH alumni community, working to connect alumni to each other and to UNH. You can learn what your UNH community can do for you by visiting the UNH Alumni Relations website at unh.edu/alumni. I'm pleased to introduce today's Alumni Relations webinar, Affordable Housing Crisis, How Can We Solve It? This is an extremely important topic and an issue affecting New England and the entire country. Today's moderator, Michael Swack, is a professor at the University of New Hampshire, where he has appointments at the Carsey School of Public Policy and at the Peter T. Paul College of Business and Economics. He directs the Center for Impact Finance and the Master's Program in Community Development, a program designed for adult practitioners. Michael was the founder and former dean of the School of Community Economic Development at SNHU. He was the first chairman and served for 17 years as a board member of the New Hampshire Community Development Finance Authority. He is the founding president of the New Hampshire Community Loan Fund and a founding board member of the National Association of Community Development Loan Funds. He received his doctorate degree from Columbia University, his master's degree from Harvard University, and his bachelor's degree from the University of Wisconsin-Madison. And now it is my pleasure to begin the program by turning it over to Michael.
Great, thank you, Pam. Appreciate the introduction. And I want to move quickly to do introductions of our panelists today and ask each of them to take a minute to briefly tell us a little bit about their own backgrounds. And Betsy, why don't we start with you?
Yes, welcome. Thanks you so much for having me here today. I'm Betsy Andrews Parker, and I'm the CEO of the Community Action Partnership of Stratford County. I'm also a proud 1995 grad of UNH in Health Management and Policy and Women's Studies. I'm also a Wildcat parent, so I'm very excited to have that connection still continuing. After UNH, I did a little bit of time in the Peace Corps. I graduated from BU with my master's in public health with a concentration in epidemiology and behavioral health. And so many of you may be saying, how in the world did you get yourself to community action between here and here? I think, community action, if you're not familiar with us, we do everything from Head Start to child care to weatherization, but most recently, we've been the lead housing stability programs leading up here in Stratford County. Out of the work we do is social determinants of health. And we really firmly believe that housing is how we get people to be successful. And I'm really excited to be here today to talk about what we're facing here, particularly for our clients that we serve here. So thanks for having me.
Great, thanks, Betsy. Sarah, why don't we move to you next?
Sure, happy to. Thanks. I'm glad to be here, everyone. My name is Sarah Reitzman. I'm the Community Engagement Coordinator at New Hampshire Housing. Prior to that, I was the Executive Director of the Workforce Housing Coalition of the Greater Seacoast. I am a New Hampshire native. I've lived in basically a 10-mile radius of the UNH Durham campus my entire life. I am a 3-time graduate from UNH, so I have my associate's degree from Thompson School in Culinary Arts and Nutrition, so a long, long way from where I am in housing now. I have a bachelor's degree in dietetics, and then my master's degree came from the Carsey School of Public Policy, and they're new at the time masters of public policy programs. So really excited to talk about housing today, a topic that I'm very passionate about and I sort of live and breathe.
Great, thank you, Sarah. Antonio?
Hi, thank you for having me. I appreciate it. And thank you everybody for joining. My name is Antonio Serna. I am a graduate student in public policy at the Carsey School, UNH. I got my bachelor's in social work last year. And my background in housing has largely been through internships and fellowships. I interned with Sarah and Nick Taylor at the Workforce Housing Coalition, looking at barriers to workforce housing developments through the local permit approval process. And then this past summer, 2022, I worked with the Massachusetts Housing and Shelter Alliance, looking at barriers to siting permanent supportive housing for people experiencing homelessness. and publish a report on that. And I'm excited to continue the conversation.
Great, thanks, Antonio. I should point out today that we'd really like to have questions and input. So there's a Q&A feature you see at the bottom of your screen. If you have questions or issues you'd like us to discuss, please post them on the Q&A. I'll be monitoring that and we'll make sure that it gets into the conversation. The housing crisis, if you're joining us today, then you're probably familiar with the litany of issues that's affecting the crisis. Rising inflation, increasing construction and labor costs, high land costs, restrictive zoning in the various communities. All this makes it difficult to develop affordable both multifamily and single family housing. And it isn't looking better, notwithstanding some really important efforts that the state has made, most particularly Invest New Hampshire, which has set aside $100 million to invest in affordable housing over the next couple of years. But Betsy, let me start with you. What do you see as the biggest challenges facing the affordable housing market today, based on your perspective and where we could go?
Absolutely. So for those who don't know, Community Action works with people who are experiencing low to moderate income. And back in the day, people would probably think of that as like the federal poverty level. But what we're seeing now is many of the folks that are graduating from UNH are not able to afford places. I mean, our biggest challenge right now is that, particularly in our market in Stratford County and other markets close to the Boston market, Portland market, is they don't have to be affordable because people are able to pay the rents. And so our biggest challenge right now is that landlords are able to get a higher price for these for these units. And there's a huge demand with a lot of this hybrid and work from home. So folks that have really migrated out of the sort of higher income, higher expense areas in Boston and those areas have moved here. So the demand and the other challenges that we have for affordable housing is just the stigmas and barriers that people have for people who maybe have been on assistance or have maybe a prior conviction or don't make enough money and have a bad credit history. So all those things, but basically the landlords can get the money. So that's my biggest challenge right now.
Okay, well, we'll get back to that in just a minute. Sarah, be interested from your perspective, what do you see as the biggest challenges facing the affordable housing market today in New Hampshire?
Sure. So the team at New Hampshire Housing that I'm part of, the work that we do is largely, I would define it as it's myth busting, it's education, because the biggest challenge is us. We get in our own way. And it's the fears and misunderstandings about what is affordable housing, what is workforce housing. And as a result, we have exclusionary zoning in New Hampshire. It really is our local land use regulations. That is the challenge, the biggest challenge. But we can't change those until we change the attitudes and mindsets of individuals. And so a lot of our work ends up being community engagement. We're talking with people, we're driving sort of local conversations about housing and trying to get at, yes, we have all this great data, we have these great resources, like we can point you to some awesome studies, some great data that we have or that others have, but it's largely about having conversations and making it about people first. And so the challenge is really that we don't see that when you hear the term, and the jargon doesn't help, but when you hear the term affordable housing, when you hear the term workforce housing, people have different ideas of what those words mean. And that's really, really, really challenging. That stands in the way of change, of growth, of creativity, of flexibility in our local land use regulations that allows developers and others to do what they need to do to create more housing supply and specifically more affordable housing.
So Sarah, let me drill down on that a little bit, because it's an interesting comment you made at the beginning, which is, we need to change attitudes before we can do anything. But, one of the things we've seen in a very polarized United States over the past few years is that it's really difficult to change attitudes. Can you talk about an example maybe of where you've been successful in getting people to actually change their attitudes or think differently, or at least, if not, expressing attitudes that are negative attitudes around affordable housing, where they're at least willing to listen and participate in a discussion. So I'd be curious into what success you've had in changing attitudes and what you've done to achieve that.
Sure. So I'll start with New Hampshire Housing has a guide. George Regan, community engagement manager, and I wrote it together called How Do We Talk About Housing? And it is quite literally a 9-step guide to local housing conversations. How do you end up in a community? You know, you live in a community, you're concerned about housing in that community. Maybe you have your grown kids living with you and you don't want that, but they can't afford any housing in their community, or you yourself want to downsize into something smaller and there's nothing to downsize into. So where do you start? And so you start by just talking to people and building relationships. And that's what we find really works, is just people getting together and having conversations, sharing their housing stories, and just talking to each other like human to human. Because when we take away all like the legalese, the workforce housing law, the definitions of what is workforce housing, what does that mean, and how does it translate into prices and, you know, economics of development. We strip away all of that stuff. Like at the end of the day, and we just have like sort of human to human conversations we can all relate to. We're all impacted by this housing crisis, right? But part of what's challenging about this work is that work, community engagement, bringing people together, leading to a point where you have a success story, you have some local zoning change, right, is slow. It's incremental. It's sort of painfully slow. It takes a lot of time. And sometimes by the time you get to the finish line, you're like, awesome. Like we worked in this one community for the past, 7 years. We finally got them to change their ADU ordinance. And like, that's a win. And we celebrate every single win that we get. Right. But truly, in my experience, it's been about doing things like let's get together a housing coalition or a housing committee at the local level that can have these conversations and sort of drive that work forward. And so I've worked in many of the mostly seacoast communities or around the sort of southern New Hampshire area, doing exactly that. Bring people together, have a conversation, get them talking, and then doing things too, like show them some visuals. What does it actually look like? What does your zoning allow right now? And what could it look like if your zoning was different? Because that visual thing helps a lot, because a lot of it is like, what are you picturing when you hear the phrase workforce housing or affordable housing? And what you're picturing and what it really means could be totally different.
Yeah.
And then just being cognizant of taking sort of like a tailored approach to every community. What we talk about in Manchester and what we talk about in Temple are two totally different things, because they're very different communities. And so customizing your approaches in every community.
Sarah, I'm wondering, not to put you on the spot or anything, but is there a particularly compelling single example you can think of at a meeting you were at, or where someone where you could see someone's attitude change a little bit? I'm just wondering if there's anything that comes to mind right away that was an aha moment, so to speak.
It's hard to pull any single example, because in every example that I can think of both wins and losses. So like the Workforce Housing Coalition, along with the Regional Economic Development Center in 2018, I believe 2019, did a charrette program in Pelham. And that was really, really powerful. We did a ton of like free work community engagement, where we had some, like we showed the documentary Communities and Consequences. We showed the first one, and at the senior center. So we got, folks who were at the senior center involved, and they had this just like great conversation afterwards where I was like, wow, this was going so fantastic. And in a way, there were successes there. They did end up changing their ADU ordinance, and that was awesome. But there were also additional challenges that happened. And so in any one sort of scenario, it's not usually all wins. It's usually a little forward, a little backwards, and that's okay. If you think about communities like Dover, for example, is just doing a really fantastic job with their zoning, and that community is really engaged.
So just some of the questions are coming in. This one ties right into what you were saying, Sarah. So you talked about changing attitudes. Have any zoning regulations changed in response? Can you give a specific example?
Yeah, absolutely. We see zoning ordinances change little by little all over the state. There's like I mentioned, Pelham's ADU ordinance changed. Dover changed theirs a few years ago in response to how people are using it. Dover has their like TDR ordinance. That was definitely an example of that. Portsmouth a few years ago did their gateway mixed use zoning ordinance. So there's lots of great examples out there that we can look at as sort of like lessons learned or creative or flexible ways to change housing at the local level.
But I just want to add something in here. Sorry, that talk about polarization and words that you use. It used to be called affordable or workforce housing, and now people are using the words, oh no, it has to be attainable housing. Well, you can't obtain housing if you don't have the resources such as a job, access to healthcare, all those other things that go along with it. So you talk about the polarization. People are trying to change the words to try and make it like everyone can get this. And I'm sorry, everyone can't get housing. Like that's the reality of that. And the other one too is all these great zoning changes that happen. And I happen to live in Dover and I support, they really are very progressive, but there's always a loophole around there. So instead of having 6 floors, I'll do 5 floors and don't have to meet that minimum requirement. I will trade this development down here and affordable units down there if we move all those affordable units someplace else. And I think that when you're talking about like the barriers are, we'll do this, but we don't want them here, meaning the affordable housing. We don't want the population. So I just wanted to point out that these words that we use, and when you do it, it sounds great, but there still continue to be barriers for people to obtain housing, good housing with quality schools, accessibility to bus routes, accessibility to grocery stores instead of being in food deserts, all those kind of things. Sorry, that, I mean, my angle is community action and just like all the work we do, there's great stuff, but there still are, and people's attitudes don't change until their kid can't get a place to live, their relative can't get a place to live, or they want to downsize, or their backyard that's been woods is suddenly not going to become high density housing that comes through.
Right. Yeah.
Right.
Antonio, let me bring you into this and then we'll get back to others. But let me ask you the first question that I asked both Sarah and Betsy, which is, what do you see as the biggest challenges today? We're already a few minutes into it. They've probably already been mentioned, but be interested in getting your perspective. Also, as someone who's worked in our neighboring state, which probably has at least as big a challenge as we do in terms of affordable housing.
Yeah, so I mean, a lot of what Betsy and Sarah have talked about is kind of, is very similar. So we talk about, or similar to what I'm thinking. So we talk about, cultural ideology, as well as, kind of behavior change and how that impacts the opportunity for housing through local zoning ordinance changes and things like that, right? But something I want to kind of harp on a little bit more that Betsy mentioned was this idea of affordability. Because when we talk about affordability, saying like 60 to 80% of the area median income is what is like workforce housing, or housing for moderate to low income people. For people who, and just I mean, maybe just as a quick example, 60% of a $70,000 area median income is $42,000. $42,000 is what I would be trying to, was what with a bachelor's degree in social work, I would, try to get salary wise, or what is like attainable for me. But that's with a bachelor's degree. A lot of people don't even have the education or the work experience to be able to get higher paying jobs. And so when we focus affordability requirements on housing that is, aimed at 60 to 80% area median income, that is largely unattainable by people making for less than $40,000 a year, which is a lot of people. And so this whole idea of affordability and pushing for these kinds of, inclusionary, I mean, we'll talk about it more, but, inclusionary zoning ordinances that kind of have these affordability components. I think it's time we start really talking about what affordability means and focus on, kind of what is attainable for lower income people. That's a real challenge that I see.
Yeah, let me get to a couple more questions then that are coming in on the Q&A. One of them is, you mentioned exclusionary zoning, and the question is, what types of housing should we be building? What are the price points for that? Maybe Sarah, we can start with you on that, dealing with exclusionary zoning and what are we looking for? What's the question? What are the price points for?
Right. So I'll start with typologies, because truly it's we need a mix, right? People are diverse, our preferences, our lifestyles are diverse. People, have big families, have small families, have kids, have no kids. Like, we need a range of sizes. So small homes, big homes, small places to live, big places to live. And then things like re-legalizing missing middle housing, those things like duplexes and triplexes and quads and accessory dwelling units. Like, the more diversity we have in our housing supply, the more likely it is that we have something that sort of suits everybody's needs. And in terms of price points, I feel like I can't answer that. And the reason why is because affordability. So the way that we define affordability is basically you're not spending more than 30% of your income on your housing costs, right? So that means that affordability is completely subjective. All housing is affordable to someone. And so same thing with housing types. For price points, we need a range of price points. We need a range of prices because there's a range of incomes. And if we look at like the workforce housing law, we have a specific way that we define workforce housing. For rental housing, it's housing that's affordable to people making 60% of the area median income or less. But like, we also need housing that's affordable to people making 50% of the area median income, making 40%, making 30%, making 20%, et cetera. Like, we need housing for everybody, regardless of their age, their income, their lifestyle, their preferences, opportunities for them to buy, opportunities for them to rent. We just need a little bit of everything.
Yeah, I mean, just summarize that really, what we're saying is we need everything. We need more multifamily housing, as Betsy pointed out, multifamily housing that's accessible to transportation, accessible to food, but we also need opportunities for people who want to buy single family houses who simply can't afford it and can't get in the market. It's more of everything, it seems, is what's really needed right now. It leads to a question that Betsy, let me start off with you on this, which is, so what role should the government be playing? I mean, we see quite a bit. There are national programs that come out of HUD, for example, but most states have programs. I mentioned briefly the $100 million Invest New Hampshire, but that's a one-time deal. That's, it's $100 million. It's divided in a couple ways. When it's gone, it's gone. Can you talk more generally about the role that government should play in making housing available and affordable?
Absolutely.
And maybe what you've seen in terms of something that's worked well.
Absolutely. So, I mean, I think the biggest thing, if you're looking at people moving into housing, and I just want to point out too, when we talk about income, this may put it in perspective. The HUD income limits that they have for Portsmouth and Rochester for the median that we have is a median family income in our area, Portsmouth, Rochester, is $116,000. Merrimack is 101, but Coas County is 70. So imagine that swing of looking at that. So when Antonio was talking about 30%, those things, just the median, meaning half above, half below, 116,000. There you go. So what role does government have in playing with that? I mean, first of all, I think our planning and our zoning boards have a huge role locally. Everything is local here. The state has invested some great money, but that money from Invest New Hampshire was sucked up with a few number of projects. I think that, Sarah, you hit the nail on the head. It takes years to get things through both planning, conceptual, funding, and let's not talk about the banking crisis and the interest rates and those things. So all of those things play a factor in there. So things that are not popular, TIFs in communities to help developers come in, looking more at mixed use, being able to zone. Again, we talk about high density. So we're putting more smaller houses on a lot versus different things. But the government does have a role to play because they're the ones who set the rules and regulations and what our community is going to do. The rental program that we saw come through called NERAP, the Emergency Rental Assistance Program, truly showed us that positive income for families actually put them on a positive trajectory to be able to stabilize themselves. And so that role, and I'm not talking about universal basic income for everyone, but I will say that we did see a success of over 4,000 households in our county be able to maintain their housing, schooling, job stabilization, and getting well both physically and mentally with their medical needs because they were stably housed. There's a huge role in that if we want people to be successful.
Betsy, there's a question from one of the participants that's similar, but with a little bit of a twist on the end here that I might ask you about as well. And the participant asks, first of all, in case you think people don't notice, this participant says Betsy has that awesome vote poster behind her.
Tell you that Rock the Vote in 1993 in Lollapalooza. There we go. I've dated myself because that's what matters. That's why I have it there.
Well, regardless, the question here is, can you talk a bit about what we can do looking at laws, policies, et cetera, specifically with regards to talking to our representatives?
Yeah, so again, so we have a wonderful federal delegation that is a huge advocate for the work here. But again, it comes back down to getting involved. I truly believe on your planning boards, your zoning boards, running for office and being elected, because that's where the change happens. It also is being informed about what happens. So if you see a master plan coming out, get involved in your community. That even includes things like parks, honestly, and recreation. So if people want to see how to make a difference, it's understanding and being an advocate for that change. And change is hard for communities, but we have to look at ways also to diversify our tax base and things that are coming out. So again, talk about that mixed use. No, so don't be against having commercial and housing come together, because we're trying really to diversify the tax base to keep taxes low. I don't know if that answered that person's question, but again, run for office and
get to say this is a note to anonymous attendee: run for office.
Or just or show up and pay attention. And also, I would also say, don't just listen to the social media chat boards that tend to be one-sided. You really have to look at everything in perspective and see it. And again, getting involved in your local community is a great way about doing that.
Yeah, thanks. Here's another question, and I'll just throw it open to whoever wants to answer it, from one of the participants. If the housing gap is over 20,000 and growing, what constraints exist within the supply of construction capital funding? Even if you solved for the zoning and cultural issues, which we have talked about, the need for new investment capital is likely very large, greater than what's available from HUD or New Hampshire. So
I will tell you what the constraints are. Sorry, because I'm in the middle of trying to, we are closing in on a rehab project to create 21 affordable housing units for seniors in Rochester. So here's my challenge: a supply chain issue. We have an issue where we literally may have to send someone like to the manufacturer in Mexico to go get our supply chain piece so we can be able to get our CO. I have a back order on my elevator due to COVID and things. So we have that's coming through. So think about your supply chain and the ordering. My interest rates have gone up. So all of these things have really made it that and we have such great partners with New Hampshire Housing and our tax credit people. However, you cannot get around interest rates, COVID supply chain issues, workforce issues, and all those things drive up the cost, which means I cannot offer, it's harder and harder to offer affordable rents. It comes in. So that's just a reality. And I don't know what this current climate means and whether or not we will see a slowdown of people doing construction based upon how much it truly costs to create housing.
Yeah. Sarah, do you want to weigh in on that as well? It seems like a big question, and Antonio as well after Sarah.
So at New Hampshire Housing, we talk about the 5 L's, right? So that's lumber, labor, land, loans, and laws. And this is we talk about this all the time. These are the factors, these are the barriers, the impediments to housing development. And we focus the vast majority of our attention on laws because that's something that we feel like we can control. Like construction costs, that's lumber, like they're high. There's not a ton we can do about it. Maybe there's some room for some flexibility or innovation. Somebody yesterday at a different presentation asked me about like 3D printing houses. Like maybe there's something we can do about construction costs. Who knows? Labor, workforce availability, that's kind of an interesting thing where it's a cycle with the housing shortages, because we know that housing shortages means we have workforce shortages. Workforce shortages means that it's harder to build housing because our construction companies or developers also have labor shortages. Land, it's finite, but maybe we can use it a little bit better. We can use it a little bit more efficiently. We focus on things like infill where we have, or like conversion, something like that, where like we have opportunities to use the land that is already developed better. loans. Maybe there's some things we can do with financing. I was just talking with someone this morning who I know is in the audience about creating some financing programs for accessory dwelling units. Like there are things that we can do, but again, we focus on that 5th L laws because it's where we feel like we have some opportunity to do something. It's where we have some control of sort of what's going on.
Yeah, that's a good point. Just to get something before I get to you, Antonio, to respond to that, it is really looking at the land issue. We just finished some work across the state where we're working with a number of hospital systems. And Betsy, you and I need to talk after this, but particularly looking at how can hospitals and health organizations invest in social determinants of health in ways that they haven't thought about necessarily. Through their endowments, through their treasury function. And also what we've talked to many of them about is donation or long-term lease of land. Because one of the things we saw in our study was that there are a number of institutions that have a lot of land, some of which could be repurposed and used for affordable housing. And these are often the institutions that talk most about not being able to find employees who can afford housing, for example. And so, one of the issues is, can we look at available land and talk to institutions who may not have ever thought that this could be a way that they could contribute, including many nonprofit institutions that have land. So I'm wondering if there's been any looking into that or any examples you've seen. I've seen it in work that we've done in other states where major hospital systems have stepped up to the plate and actually not been the developers, but have donated or established very low cost long-term leases for the purpose of developing affordable housing. Mm-hmm. So let me throw that out there and see, what sort of thinking has there been in New Hampshire? Are you aware of any institutions that have become more involved in trying to solve the affordable housing process in that way?
Yeah, well, I know an example of an institution that is donating land to a nonprofit developer, but because of the way it's zoned, they are going back. They went to the planning board back at the beginning of the year. They will not be able to have the zoning issue resolved until November. So here's an example of an institution donating land to develop 60 to 80 affordable housing units. And this is this process. And this cost of this is, so let's just take a nonprofit that sits on land. The cost of developing housing can be upwards of $100,000, if not more. So again, there's lots of great programs. I'm thinking of some stuff with NIFA about having grants available to help get those costs there. But getting into the housing market and getting into developing and having all of that, there's also not enough developers in the area or people who can front those costs. I mean, those costs are extraordinary, and most of them you can get back when you develop. But again, that can be 3 years down the road. I'll talk about our housing project that we have. We have put out over $200,000 in pre-development costs. We will be getting those back, but you have to have those assets to be able to get there. And those are just some of the challenges that some people just think, well, just do it. It's not that easy.
Right. Although it is a huge cost. When I talked not too long ago with Robert Tourney, who many of you know from Southern New Hampshire, NeighborWorks, mm-hmm. He was saying that the cost of land is what makes things unaffordable, and that this sort of solution would be one that would really help that particular nonprofit developer. Mm-hmm. Let me follow up with another question here to anyone that ties into what we were just talking about. Many of the decisions about housing zoning seem to get made with input from the community. How do we take into consideration the inputs of people who would like to live in the community but can't afford to, or just don't live there yet? For example, I want to move to Durham to finish grad school at UNH, but I'm having an incredibly hard time doing so because of the lack of housing. I wish I could have gone to community meetings 10 years ago and advocated for more housing to be built, but that's obviously now how it works. Let me actually put one additional item on that, which is I read something recently that really clicked, which is, in community development, we always talk about how important it is to engage the community in decision making. Mm-hmm. And one of the problems is that we're seeing now is sometimes that's what kills you, is when you engage. When is, the article I think was entitled something like, when is community participation bad? And basically the answer was when community participation is used to exclude anyone who doesn't live there already. So getting to his question, what might your response be? And Antonio, let's start with you if you have a response. You're close, you're a graduate student now too. You probably face a similar problem.
Suffering from the housing market. Yeah.
Right.
So I mean, Sarah already kind of touched on this, and using the Pelham example, the Pelham charrette example, but charrettes really do seem to be, a kind of comprehensive way to include the input of community members in designing projects, right? Being able to sit with them and say, does this meet some of your concerns around rural character, urban character, whatever that might be, community character, I should say. And be able to design something that makes sense for them. But something else that, I've kind of been looking into in Massachusetts around homelessness is this idea of like housing task forces or homelessness task forces, which incorporate not just the community itself, but also regional bodies. So continuums of care, or CDCs. In New Hampshire, you have regional planning commissions, RPCs. So having people at the table who are able to advocate for communities at a regional level seem like a really good source of incorporating the experiences of people who don't live in that community. And for those, regional organizations, if you are going to have some kind of input through a local task force or even a regional task force, it would make sense to have some kind of, community member advisory board who would be able to provide input directly. And, where you're talking really representative systems, then that community advisory board would have other community advisory boards within local communities to be able to go into neighborhoods and have a neighborhood representative to advocate for their for their needs and for whatever they want. That's kind of what I think about incorporating the experiences and needs of people who don't already live in that community.
Yeah, no, that's a great idea. Sarah, let me go to you on that as well, because one of the things we've seen is often the people who volunteer are the activists, so to speak, who want to see that change, who are then overruled by the other people in the community who don't want to see it. I mean, I've seen that in several situations where the people say, yes, we need to have a task force and look at how we can create more affordable housing in the town of X. And they come up with a really good plan. And then when it's released to the community as a whole in town meeting or a vote, it's like, we don't want that. Get out of here.
So I feel like I don't have, I read this question when it came through in the Q&A a bit ago, and I've been thinking about it, and I don't feel like I have a great answer to it, but I do want the question asker to know that I love this question. It's something that I think about all the time, which is this idea that the decisions that are getting made at the local level by, the planning board, the council, the select board, whomever the decision-making body is, are ridiculously just incredibly important. And the people who come out and speak at public hearings in that community, who live in that community, have a lot of influence on those decisions. And what that means at the end of the day is that you have very important decisions being made about the community by a very, very, very small fraction of the people who live in that community, and isn't inclusive of the people who don't live in that community because they can't live in that community. And our housing crisis, just sort of as a topic in our economy, does not care about your town lines. Like, this crisis is regional. The economy is regional. It just does not care. And so we need input from people who are outside of that community. And I can sort of personally relate to this specific example because I lived in Newmarket when I went to grad school at UNH. That was where I found a place that I could afford. I lived in Durham after that. I was really lucky to find a place that I could live in Durham, which seemed like such a rarity as sort of an adult who was renting. And then when I went to buy my first home, my husband and I wanted to start a family. I went to buy my first home, and Durham was not an option. I was on the planning board. I started the housing task force in Durham. I was on the economic development committee. My husband was on a first name basis with everybody at the juicery because he went there every day. Like, we were rooted in this community, and it was not an option for us. There were, I think when we were looking, there were 3 houses on the market. 2 of them were out of our price range, and the other one we just didn't like. And there's some dignity in being able to make a choice about where you live, right? You don't just buy the only house that's in your price range. And so we're in Newmarket now, and we're rooted in this community, and we're happy to be here. But like, that's what happens when you don't have options for housing, is that you lose people who are rooted in that community. You lose people who are part of that community, who are willing to do things like serve on the planning board, which is extremely not glamorous just as a thing to do, serving on the planning board, but it's really important. And you need those volunteers, and you need younger people to get involved. But there are a lot of barriers to being a decision maker, to getting involved at the local level, and to being an advocate. So
Yeah, just to push this one a little further, Antonio, I'm sure you're familiar with it, having worked in Massachusetts as well. As Massachusetts and a couple other states around the country, as you know, now have state laws that require local communities to meet basic affordable housing quotas, the 10%, this Chapter 40 that's been in existence, and which has had, I would argue, some success in getting communities that otherwise would not develop it. So in a sense, it's the state has overridden this concept of complete community control, because in fact, complete community control has resulted in no new affordable housing. The communities just excluded. I wonder if you have a thought on terms of the success of that in Massachusetts, as well as how much something like that might go over in New Hampshire. I mean, it seems like a hard one, but you know, do we need something like that at the state level to encourage communities to essentially meet their fair share?
Yeah, well, thank you for the question. I mean, this is something that, really stuck out to me about Massachusetts, is that their state laws around housing are a lot more progressive than New Hampshire. They mandate things. They say that communities need to do this. So the law that you bring up is, for those who don't know, is called Chapter 40B. It forces a zoning board of adjustment at the local level to be flexible in zoning ordinances for an affordable housing development if the housing development has 20 to 25% of its units affordable. But that is only required of zoning boards of adjustment, ZBAs, if that community's housing stock is less than 10% affordable. So the problem with it, and it is a good law. It's been around since, I believe, the 70s or 60s, is that it has created a lot of units over the years. So the CHAPA, an organization in Massachusetts, tracks this, but I believe it's created thousands of affordable housing units. But the problem with it is that we're now at the point where communities are at the 10% affordable limit, and they don't
go any further, right?
Yeah, they don't have to accept any more affordable housing projects. And so now it is their right to deny affordable housing projects. And so, thinking about this kind of application in New Hampshire, which, right now doesn't even exist. We have the workforce housing statute, which, kind of says that there has to be realistic opportunities for affordable housing development through workforce housing. But in terms of, percentages and, what, like, percentages of the housing stock in the local community and what that really looks like, it's not exactly spelled out. And it's only beginning to be addressed through the state housing court. So the way I see it is that you can do enforcement through the housing court. So you have this kind of mechanism to, not allow communities to outright ban affordable housing opportunities, which seems like so far as a reasonable enforcement mechanism. But you could also just legislate at the state level, change the workforce housing statute so that it has real affordability components and holds communities accountable, because all what we're talking about here with the affordable housing and kind of investment from nonprofits is a recognition that the private market isn't meeting the needs of low to moderate income people, and that there has to be government intervention. And so it makes sense then for the state to step in and say, okay, then there has, like, a certain percentage of the community needs to be affordable. And maybe in New Hampshire, that is that 10%. Maybe we, even though Massachusetts did it 50 years ago, maybe it's our time now to step up and say, all right, like, that's a great law. If we were serious about affordable housing and investing in affordable housing solutions, then we need to provide a realistic opportunity through statewide legislation.
Right. I think, if you look at our current environment, that may be more likely today than it was 20 or 30 years ago, simply because so many businesses today simply can't find places for their workers the workers can't find a place to live. And so there's this labor shortage, which is really directly tied to housing. So, the environment changes over time. I want to get to more of these questions. This is such a great group of participants. I have a long list of questions. I threw out my questions a long time ago. I'm just trying to navigate through these and try and group them as best as I can and get to all the questions. One that's been up here for a while, which is one that's personally interest to me. Are there examples of cooperative housing models in the state that are not manufactured housing parks? Although I think it's worth, for those who aren't here, talking about the manufactured housing parks, because there are thousands of units and they really are among the most affordable in the state, and talk about negative perceptions that the panelists have. Boy, nothing has more of a negative perception than a manufactured housing park. But if people visited most of them today, they'd be surprised at how nice the housing is and how affordable it is as well, and how nice many of those communities really look. But that's another one where there's a stigma to be overcome. But let's start with the question of cooperative housing. Sarah, how would you respond to that? Examples of cooperative housing throughout the state. And one of the things I might throw in there too is that people often conflate this, but much cooperative housing, like the manufactured housing cooperatives, contain a provision that's really important, which is an equity limitation clause, either in the sale of the land or in the sale of the building, which gets the question of permanent affordability. There's nothing more frustrating than government subsidy going to subsidize housing that turns around 3 years later and goes market rate, and all that subsidy is lost and the affordability is lost, and somebody's made a big profit, but not the people who need housing. So having been on my soapbox there, Sarah, let me turn it over to you. What have you seen in terms of cooperative housing models and how they fit in New Hampshire?
I'm going to start by saying I absolutely love resident-owned communities. I love the work that the Community Loan Fund does. If you ever get a chance, they do bus tours of resident-owned communities, and those are like, they're awesome. They're educational. They're myth busting. I've sort of made it. I went to one that the Workforce Housing Coalition of the Greater Seacoast hosted last year. It was just fantastic. I learned a lot from it. There is one, I don't think that there's a registration link available for it yet, but there is one in the Upper Valley that's being hosted in part by Vital Communities in the Community Loan Fund. I don't know if you can register for it yet, but I'll make sure that folks get that link, because like, just such an awesome opportunity to get to check out these resident-owned communities. I am not aware of any other cooperative housing models in New Hampshire, which doesn't necessarily mean they don't exist, but I would love to see one.
Yeah, thanks for that pitch. I'll openness here. I'm a board member and have been since the beginning of the New Hampshire Community Loan Fund, and I just think it's one of the best models I've seen, not just in New Hampshire, but in the whole country, in terms of their ability to address affordable housing issues and come up with interesting models. Betsy, I'm wondering if you have any thoughts on this as well, the idea of cooperatives, if you've looked into that, or any sort of affordability, which I think one of the keys in New Hampshire is what the resident-owned communities do as well, is its ownership. That is, you own your house, but you lease the land from yourself, essentially, as a cooperative. What it means is you don't have any incentive to sell the land underneath you. And in fact, it's limited in its resale value, that even if everybody got together and decided, so it means it's going to stay affordable, and it's going to remain much more affordable than other manufactured housing parks where the land is not owned by the co-ops. But
yeah, and the co-ops that are residentially owned are the ones that we find to be most successful, the ones that reinvest into the land, reinvest into their housing. The challenge that we find, and we saw this really with the rental program, they can afford their unit, but they cannot afford the lot rent that keeps going up and up and up. And then what do you get for that? And so we did, during the emergency rental assistance program, assist many people who could no longer afford that lot rent and went up. And the other thing though about it too is we find that ownership is challenging based on the year of the manufactured home. So the older the home, the harder it is to find financing to buy that. We do weatherization. If you're not familiar with that, people think of weatherization as, you know, plastic on your windows, but we really do a lot with insulation, windows, energy efficiency, and that a lot of mobile home work for those older mobile home units, because they may be affordable to live in, but they are hard to heat and keep warm and those things. So there's trade-offs in those things. So we are a huge proponent, but we really find that people have a hard time affording getting financing for them based on the year, those things. There's got to be a change, and there has to be a change in our zoning. We have seen many of the areas get zoned out. We've seen areas that want to expand, really great manufactured home parks that are looking for expansion that are hitting a wall with local zoning and variance and planning boards. So again, when we talk about what do we want and how do we have affordability, they're also great one floor living for people who are aging in place or have a disability as well. All of those things, I mean, all the things we complain about or how we need more of it, yet we keep getting blocked every step of the way of where we are. And I don't know how we can change that. And the other thing that's, I think, also a challenge where the land is and where it's a little more flexible is we're seeing it's driving people further and further away from resources. So in Stratford County, it's Dover, Rochester, Somersworth, they're driving people further into Farmington, Middleton, New Durham, wonderful communities, but no buses, kind of a food desert. Jobs are far away. So the lower your income, the further your drive, it's gas, it's wear and tear in your car, it's tolls, all those kind of things. So it's still a challenge over here.
So here's another one for you, Betsy, that relates to an issue you raised earlier in the conversation. Are there any studies out there that investigate the link between housing insecurity and mental health and wellness?
I probably couldn't tell you about an exact study, but I know that there are, but we live it here every single day. You know, if you want someone to be compliant, let me just say, let's use diabetes for an example. If you want someone to be compliant with your diabetes and you're very frustrated, they have to have a refrigerator, they have to have an address, they have to have all those things. So you want someone to be compliant with their medication or their mental health in a place to say they have no place to go. And I think the other thing, if you want to talk about when we do get people housed here who have mental health, any mental health, is the understanding or the compassion to work with people in the community. This may be the first time they're living back in maybe an apartment setting and how to live there. There is very little to no support in the state for people to do supportive housing and checking in on folks and helping them to be able to live and be part of a community environment. So again, we can get you housed, but if there isn't an ongoing support to make sure that you're paying your bills, are you making sure your heat's on, your music's not too loud, like all those things, then people fail, then they get an eviction. And once they get that eviction, it's just a spiral that goes out and it just continues. So, you know, there is a correlation, but I wanted to stress that we need more support for the supportive housing piece, for those continued supports. That is virtually non-existent in our entire state.
Right. Yeah. Thank you. Just as an additional resource, we have our work coming out later this month out of CARSI, in which we're looking at social determinants of health in New Hampshire, where we interviewed almost all the hospital CEOs in the state. And this issue came up consistently with all of them. You know, what is their ability to address people with mental health? Because a lot of homelessness, as you know, is tied to, among other things, mental health, but also, as you said, things like diabetes and you know, illnesses that are, if not preventable, at least treatable in ways that make a difference. And a big part of that is housing. I mean, if you don't have housing, you're not going to get better.
Well, and if you also have not been stably housed and you haven't been used to, let's say, the rules and regulations of living in housing, then again, if you put someone into housing and say, great, you got housing, there you go, you're good to go. It doesn't work that way. It literally doesn't work that way. And so I hear we get calls from all the hospitals to help house people. We work with all the people who are coming out of recovery and how they do long-term stability. We do the homeless and housing work. We do the housing first, all of those things. Again, it is what happens after you get into the housing and how we can provide those supports to make you successful. That's where we're seeing a lot of people who are falling down.
Just a quick follow-up question here. I'm not sure if any of the panelists are aware or can speak to the impact of the money coming from the opioid settlement and how that could play into housing investments for those that need workforce and housing stability.
I know that there was a grant that was put out there for organizations to apply for it. I know that we did not look and apply for that money. I'm not 100% sure about that, but that the ability for people who are coming out of treatment to have to live in recovery safe places is a huge issue. Again, also a zoning issue with a number of people who are living and paying rent. So I don't know, I can't speak to it, but I know that there were several groups that got the funding for that.
Yeah, this is also a tie-in. In Manchester, where I live, homelessness has increased, it seems, and yet solutions seem elusive. How widespread is this problem in the state? And how important is it that all communities in New Hampshire consider this an emergency? That is, if affordable housing isn't widely available, it seems some communities will have steeper housing challenges than others. Sarah, do you want to take that one?
It's a really tough one. Something that we see a lot, thinking of some of our more rural communities, is like schools close or threaten to close if we don't address the housing crisis because there aren't enough kids, and what happens after that. And maybe there's some opportunity to consolidate schools, but ultimately, communities lose their schools. I think that's the first thing that you sort of see. And then the other thing that you see is, businesses close or relocate, or when they choose to expand, they don't do it here. And so there's certainly some really devastating impacts to our economy, to our communities, and to sort of community vibrancy if we don't address this issue.
Great, thank you. Antonio, here's one that gets back to something that you mentioned earlier, more specific to New Hampshire. The participant asks, rather than state mandates, maybe creating or revising RSAs to enable municipalities to adopt mandate language under innovative land use?
I think it's a good idea. I think in New Hampshire, especially, the idea of state mandate scares a lot of people, and pushing that would be a really hard thing to get through. It's a lot more possible at the local level. And I'll say this, like a lot of local changes that come through ballot initiatives, through like town meetings or something, they're usually passed because the entire planning board unanimously supports it and puts their support on the ballot. So when it comes to, changing some kind of mandate, there needs to be community engagements around this kind of affordability component. But assuming that there is, kind of this long sustained effort to change the way people, think about affordable housing and, what it looks like in their community, it needs to be supported by members of the planning board if it is put on a ballot initiative so that it passes. Because, if it says 0.6, the planning board doesn't support it, then it's not going to happen. Or it's less likely to happen. But I think it is a great idea to change state laws to allow communities to be able to put affordability restrictions on, their housing stock.
Right.
If I can add to this one, so the legislature did try a couple years ago to allow communities to opt in to mandatory affordable housing, which would have been a big change for New Hampshire, but our sort of values of local control and our legislature certainly prefers carrots over sticks. Like, I'm typically an optimist, I don't know that that New Hampshire is going to allow for mandatory affordable housing. But there are ways that communities, municipalities in New Hampshire can incentivize affordable housing to make sure that it's such an enticing deal that of course the developer is going to take it. So that's something like density bonuses, where you could build X number of units by right, but if you want to build X plus however many units, then you have to allow a percent of them have to be affordable housing. And like, that's a really great way to do this. Just have to make sure that the math works. It has to make sense for a developer or they'll never take advantage of it. It has to be such a good deal for the developer that they couldn't possibly not do it, right? It's just a much better deal to build, X plus 60 units and get some affordable housing in there too. And then the end result ends up being mixed income projects, which we love. We love having a combination of market rate and affordable housing units together mixed in.
Yeah. Well, we're coming near the end of our time, and I'm sorry, there's still a bunch of questions in the chat that we didn't get to. I mean, this has been a great group of participants. I mean, this is one of the most dynamic webinars I've seen in terms of really engaging participants and having our three experts really weigh in on some of the suggestions. So we had a chance today to review some of the issues that we all know about, but look into some of the possible solutions. We talked about laws and regulations. We talked about financing options and the use of incentives, as you just did, Sarah. We talked about changing attitudes and how difficult that is to do. And I think what we can conclude from all this is that really the solution to this problem, it has multiple approaches. It involves trying to organize within communities around affordable housing. It involves working with developers to create incentives. It involves creative new ways of financing to get people into the market. And it involves, I think, going back really to where we began, changing attitudes about, and it's never easy to do that. I mean, sometimes we often say if we can change behaviors, maybe that's even better than changing attitudes, because changing attitudes may take a generation or more. Let me thank the panelists today, Antonio, Betsy, and Sarah, for your incredibly good answers and wisdom in this regard, and really appreciate your taking the time to join us today at UNH.
Right. Thanks for having us here today and raising the topic. The more we talk about it, the more change we'll start to see. That this is wonderful. Thank you.
Yeah,
Okay.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Yep. Thanks, everybody. We'll send out follow-up emails with links to access some of these answers. Thanks, everybody. Take care.
Thank you.